The first week in January in Auburn, Alabama was cold. Most of the days there was a drizzly rain. And any other year I would have spent that time getting the campus ministry building cleaned up, doing some planning for the programs for the following semester, and maybe take an hour or two off at the pool room across the street. I was the campus pastor there for the Methodist Church. But this year was different. This was 1964. And this was the year that Harold Franklin would integrate the university. Harold Alonzo Franklin was married, graduate student from Alabama State College, an African-American school, and would be the first African-American to enroll at the segregated Auburn University. It was a day of high drama. A lot of the drama had taken place before then. Ole Miss had integrated to the tune of violence and buildings being burned. Governor George Wallace had stood in the schoolhouse door, so to speak, at University of Alabama and swore that there would never be integration in the universities. We all knew that that was not true, that integration was inevitable. And some of us, campus pastors, a couple of clergy, local clergy, and a couple of faculty, were trying to work behind the scenes to be sure that everything went as smoothly as possible. Some of us had gone to the University of Ole Miss and had interviewed the people there to find out what had happened, what had gone wrong, what perhaps we could do to help. And law enforcement at all levels, of course, were involved. The mood was very volatile. A deal had been struck that George Wallace would not come on the campus and make a public statement. And in turn, the FBI and the Justice Department would not also come on the campus, and they were housed at the Holiday Inn just a few blocks away from the campus. Colonel Al Lingo, who was head of the Alabama State Highway Patrol, had 150 troopers surrounded the campus, not so much to keep order, but to keep Harold Franklin from ever getting onto the campus to register in the first place. That in itself had drama that I'm not privy to, but I do know that Fred Gray, Harold's attorney, and Harold were able to get onto the campus. Tom Murphy, the Presbyterian campus pastor, and I agreed to camp out in the lounge at Magnolia Hall. That was the residence hall that Harold would be housed in. So we could keep an eye on things and report if there was any violence or potential violence that we could see. Well, that day went very uneventful. As I said, they were able to get onto the campus. They were escorted into Magnolia Hall, and Harold was settled in, so Tom and I left. The next morning I was riding my bicycle into my office, and I stopped by the local Presbyterian church to see if John had picked up any information, and he was on the phone when I went in, and he put his hand over the receiver and said, "Somebody needs to talk to Harold right away." I said, "What's the deal?" He finished his conversation, and he said that was from one of the faculty who doesn't want to be identified for fear of reprisal. But he said that Harold had signed up for the two toughest classes, two toughest faculty that he possibly could choose, and that while they may not intentionally flunk him, they'll make it so hard on him that it'll be almost impossible for him to succeed. Somebody needs to tell him that. And I said, well, I don't know if you'll listen to me or not, but I'll be glad to, if you give me the keys to your car, I'll run over and talk to him. Magnolia Hall was the other side of the campus. So I did. When I got there, I had to call Harold's room. He was the only person in that one wing, three-story wing of the dorm, and he was at the second floor in the middle of the hall for his protection, so the story was. So I called him. He came down. The doors were locked from the inside. He came down, let me in, and we talked, and I told him the story. And I said, Harold, you don't know me, but I suggest that you take this under advisement. Don't make it any harder on yourself than you have to. And he thanked me. We walked out of the hall. He was on his way to class. And it was beginning to rain, so I said, look, I'll drop you off. And, so we drove over to the class building, and I dropped him off. And the news media was there covering everything, of course. I drove back to John's office. When I went in, he was on the phone, and he motioned for me to sit down, and I could hear him saying, no. But a colleague of mine borrowed my car, and probably he dropped him off at class. No, I don't have any other comment. When he hung up, he told me that was a call from Washington. Now, I know it's no big deal these days, but this was before the internet and instant communication. Someone had spotted the license plate, called Washington. Washington had called John to find out what the story was. A little moment of drama. I had left the keys in the car, got my bicycle, went on to my office, and when I got there, I had a call from the mayor who said, if you like blacks, he didn't use the word black, if you like blacks so much, why don't you go back where you came from? I said, Mr. Wright, you grew up in Grove Hill, Alabama. He said, that's right. I said, actually, I grew up in Tallahassee. I'm about 90 miles closer to home than you are. Why don't you go home? It's not the smartest thing I ever said, of course. My dad was teaching school near where I grew up. And I found out later from my mother, my dad never told me the story, that the Alabama Journal came out that afternoon, identified me as being the person who drove Harold to his first day of class. I'm a junior, so my dad's name was identified, of course. And the county superintendent of schools had called my dad in, had a copy of the paper laying on the desk so that Dad could see it when he came in, and it suggested that it was time for him to retire. Dad never, as I said, never told me this story, but when Mother told me that years later, I asked what was Dad's response, and she said, well, he just said no and walked out. Dad wasn't on the same page that I was on as far as the integration and the civil rights, but he respected me, and I respect him for that. The integration of Auburn went peaceful. The next year there were about 9 African Americans, one of whom was active in our campus ministry center. That in itself caused a little flap within the church, but that's another story. I saw Harold a few years ago. My wife and I looked him up in Talladega. Talladega is his home. It's about 100 miles away from Auburn. It's where he grew up. And by the way, he didn't graduate from Auburn. The pressure was so intense, even though he was performing academically, that he transferred and got his degree from the University of Denver. But Harold and I met. He taught college classes for a while at Talladega College, and is now the director of a funeral home there. We greeted each other, shook hands, sat down and visited for quite some time. And one of the things that was important to me, because time distorts memory, was to realize that Harold remembered what had happened pretty much the same way that I had. Auburn is still not an interracial university. In 2007, less than 9% of the enrollment were African Americans. In 2001, they called Harold back and presented him with an honorary doctorate of arts. And who knows what the future is going to be. I don't tell this story in any way to suggest that I was key or instrumental in the integration of the university. This is how I participated. I've never seen myself as being in the mainstream or in the center of the civil rights movement. But I tell the story because of what it did for me. It helped direct my life. And I firmly believe that regardless of how the future plays out, the door that Harold Franklin opened when he enrolled at Auburn University is a door that will never ever be completely shut.